All right, history students, for 12, history 1218. This is going to be the second part of the comments, moving you guys through chapter 10. We left off on slide 36. It was a painting about stump speaking. Slide 37, we're looking at the Democrats and the Whigs. The Democrats and the Whigs are going to be the two main political parties, the 1830s. The Democrats are going to be essentially the biggest area of focus in terms of national politics in this era was going to be focusing on the Bank of the United States, the tariffs, and the internal improvements, all three pillars of the American system that had been pushed for by all the way from Madison to Monroe to Adams. So the as Jackson comes into power, as the Democrats come into power, they are looking to shrink the size of government and really lessen the effect of government in terms of the everyday lives of Americans. The Democrats are going to be successful in these fashions, and they are mainly going to draw their base of political support from people who are of more meager socioeconomic means, especially farmers and mechanics and artisans. Are going to be more likely to support the Democrats. The Whigs are going to be in favor of more government intervention, a larger, more powerful government in terms of its scope and its ability to impact the American economy. They're going to be their base of political support is going to be more centered in the northern areas of the United States. And it's much more likely that they are going to be from the upper reaches of the socioeconomic strata. One of the big splits is Democrats are going to warn people that the producing class, the people that actually produce things, the people that produce manufactured goods, the people that produce agricultural goods, are going to be taken advantage of by the non-producers, the bankers and the financiers, and people who just move money around professionally. So they want to shrink the role of government because shrinking the role of government means that the producers will be able to kind of fight it out in a self-regulating market. Whereas if the government gets involved, the government's going to essentially pick favorites, and they're going to choose which of the non-producers are going to essentially be able to take advantage of the producing class. So that's a brief breakdown of political parties on slide 37. If we look at slide 38, this is a picture of the procession of victualers. This is a bunch of butchers parading through the streets of Philadelphia. This is exactly the type of people that would be expected to vote Democratic, because they would see themselves as part of the producing class. They would see themselves as able to fend for themselves if government just gets out of the way. On slide 39, we see the discussion of public and private freedom. I'm not going to say a whole lot on this. The Democrats under Jackson saw both. Excuse me. Saw freedom as freedom and morality both as private kind of endeavors. A private entitlement best protected by local governments. So this kind of informs their position as to why the federal government needs to be kind of reduced in its power, because it is not the thing that grants freedom. It's the thing that is antithetical to freedom, the thing that is most likely to take away their freedom. Jackson definitely decreased the national government's power, lowered the tariff, killed the national bank, and refused federal aid for internal improvements, so that states had to come up with the bulk of the money and the planning to get those things taken care of. When we're talking in terms of politics and morality, Democrats thought that you couldn't legislate individual morality. It was, again, a private affair. Whigs thought that you could form public policies and institutions that were more likely to be able to inculcate and inform citizens as to how to behave morally in society. Again, a fundamental kind of line of differentiation. If you could just enact the right government policies, you could get people to act morally. Both parties felt that you would need moral behavior to really have a successful nation. It was just, where would that moral behavior come from? Democrats in this era said that local governments and people in private would be free to make moral decisions, and the Whigs said that government would be or should be involved in that process. On slide 40, it looks at a county election. Another painting by the same person who put together that stump speaking painting, George Caleb Bingham. 1852 again, a voter takes an oath while the party workers dispense liquor, trying to persuade voters. So this was an era, again, of mass participation politically, and certainly there was a great deal of trying to appeal to the common man. This kind of rings through to today. There are still people who say, political candidates are more likely to win if voters can see themselves sitting down and having a beer with them. And these are sometimes referred to by political analysts as Joe Six-Pack voters. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at 41. The South Carolina and nullification, the states' rights debate. The two bullets on this slide are South Carolina and nullification, Calhoun's political theory. So the tariff that was passed in 1828 raised taxes on imported goods, again, to protect the industry in America that was just getting off and running. It made goods from everywhere else in the world, especially Britain, more expensive, so that the goods produced in America would have a chance to compete in the marketplace. The tariff of 1828 and subsequent tariffs would be seen by a lot of Southerners as an attempt for the Northerners to essentially force the Southerners to buy their products and goods. The northern section of the United States was much more industrialized than the South, and so the South was essentially looking to buy the cheapest manufactured goods, either from the North or from across the ocean internationally. And so by putting a big tariff on British goods, it was essentially forcing Southerners to buy more expensive or cheaper quality or less desirable goods from the North. And this was seen as, essentially forcing the South to pay for the North's industrialization program. Nowhere was it kind of more controversial, the tariff, than South Carolina. South Carolina believed that they could nullify it, which is essentially meaning that they could, as a state, just declare that the federal law was not going to be followed in their state. Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, probably was the leading theorist behind nullification. He said that the states had to be a necessary check and balance to federal power. He said that it was absolutely the duty of and the right of the states to decide when the federal government was acting unconstitutionally and against the long-term interests of the nation, and their job was then to nullify those actions by the federal government that they deemed unconstitutional. On slide 42, you'll see a picture of John C. Calhoun, who again made his political career followed an arc, and it took him from nationalism on the one end, where he was advocating for the federal government taking a much bigger role in internal improvements and these types of things, all the way to through the nullification crisis, to saying that the states had to have the power, enough power, to absolutely nullify anything that they didn't like the federal government doing. So he certainly transited a good deal during his career. If we look at 43, slide 43 is talking about the nullification crisis. It's a political cartoon published in 1833. Shows John C. Calhoun climbing steps, marking nullification, treason, and civil war. The cartoonist is obviously saying that this line of thinking, this thought that states should be able to just disregard any federal laws that they don't like. This is yet just another step that leads to another step, which is even more grave, which leads to another step, which is ultimately results in civil war. So, yeah, let's take a look at 44. The nullification crisis, sectionalism intensified. So in 1828, the tariff is really the thing that gets everybody's dander up in South Carolina. South Carolina threatens that they are going to nullify it. Then the federal government comes back and says, oh yeah, well, we'll pass something called the Force Act, which says we are going to use the Army to, the armed forces to come down there and force these southern states to comply. And before it actually came to that, the South Carolinians backed down. Before it actually came to that, Congress went and redid the tariffs, and they increased the tariffs in 1832, and things really came to a head. And the Congress passed the Force Act, but then finally Congress went ahead and lowered the tariffs, and the South Carolinians backed down when they reached a compromise tariff in 1833 that reduced the prices. But we could see that this is going to lay the groundwork for patterns we'll see repeated later on in history. Certainly. Let's take a look at slide 45, the Temple of Liberty. Again, another artist rendering portraying the United States as a Temple of Liberty. Center, a figure of liberty rises from the flames holding the Bill of Rights, a staff with a liberty cap, like we've seen. The Union must and shall be preserved, reads the banner. So yeah, this was definitely a period in which we see a lot of foreshadowing of the Civil War that would be happening towards the end of this course. Let's take a look at 46. 46 is the Indian removal and the Supreme Court and the Indians. Jackson's forceful nationalism in terms of his commitment to national sovereignty. Certainly during the nullification crisis, he writes eloquently in defense of national sovereignty and the ability of the federal government to exercise powers to force the states to comply with certain edicts. Certainly, his this feeling that the federal government has supreme authority is going to be put on display in his dealings with the Native Americans. In this time, we're going to see Native Americans essentially get completely removed from the east coast of the United States. East of the Mississippi, they're all going to be pushed to the west. In 1830, Jackson secured the passage of the Indian Removal Act, which allowed for the removal of tens of thousands of Indians from the Southwest. The Indian Removal Act essentially made it necessarily the case that no one thought that Native Americans were going to be assimilating into American society. This sealed the deal in terms of Native Americans were going to be pushed and marginalized as much as possible. And this came as a surprise to a number of Native Americans who had been trying to assimilate, especially the Cherokee in Georgia. They appealed their treatment all the way to the Supreme Court. In an 1832 court decision, they had said that the Native Americans were not actually owners of their own land, but they just had the right of occupancy. They were wards of the federal government, didn't have full rights as citizens. Ultimately, Georgia moved to expel the Cherokee, and the Cherokee appealed all the way to the national government, saying the states couldn't interfere with, the states couldn't expel the Cherokee because the Cherokee had certain treaties with the United States federal government, and the states couldn't do anything to alter the conditions that were agreed to under these treaties. And the Supreme Court said that's actually correct. Georgia can't remove the Cherokee because they've got these treaties, and these treaties have to be respected. And Jackson very famously said, or is purported to have said, that Justice Marshall has made his decision, now I'll let him enforce it. Of course, the Supreme Court can't enforce any of their own opinions. They have to rely on the executive branch to enforce their opinions. And so when the executive branch just declares that, well, it doesn't really have an interest in enforcing the opinions don't really amount to much. So this kind of, it's very strange. Jackson, a very contradictory person, because you can see that he runs on the idea of states' rights and lessening the power of the federal government, and then he says that when it comes to Indians, we're going to really allow the federal government to do a bunch of things to remove them, and then if the states butt up against the federal government, we're going to, he's not interested in making sure that the national government has supreme authority in the area. Pretty contradictory and pretty telling as to Jackson's feelings towards Native Americans. If you look at slide 47, it says Indian removals from 1830 to 1840. Obviously, the removal of the Cherokee from Georgia result in what is known as the Trail of Tears, as men, women, and children are forced to essentially march out of Georgia hundreds and hundreds of miles to be relocated during a very, very brutal winter, somewhere along the lines of a quarter of the Indians or Native Americans that marched on the Trail of Tears would end up dying. And with that, essentially by the 1840s, east of the Mississippi River, Native Americans were not really present. If you look at slide 48, this is of a Native American holding an alphabet. The Cherokee actually designed an alphabet so that they could have a written language, and they were publishing newspapers, and they were engaging in the kind of economic activities that they were hoping would allow them to assimilate into the American society. Obviously, that was not satisfactory to Jackson and his compatriots. Slide 49 shows hiding in the mangrove swamp. Painting showing Seminole Indians in Florida avoiding American sailors during the Second Seminole War. Certainly Jackson had been part of military adventures into Florida. Florida had been, as we noted in the previous chapter, Florida had been Spanish and had served as essentially a hideout for, or a place of refuge for slaves running away from their American masters in the South, and a number of Native Americans joined with those African Americans and essentially engaged in military conflicts. And in the First Seminole War, they actually repulsed a number of attacks. The Second Seminole War took place after Florida was essentially obtained by the United States, and it was still being used as a place to kind of hide in. The idea of hiding in a mangrove swamp is certainly, the Native Americans east of the Mississippi River were absolutely fighting and hiding and trying to hold on to the lands that they felt were their home. On slide 50, it just is a painting of a trapper and his family. Depicts a pioneer man who is married an Indian woman. On slide 51, the bull dance, painting of a ceremony of the Mandan tribe by George Catlin. This was a dance done by Native Americans to essentially bring good luck in terms of hunting buffalo. Again, an absolutely essential foodstuff and a resource for Native Americans, especially on the Trans-Mississippi West. Let's take a look at slide 52. How did the Bank War influence the economy and party competition? Certainly, on slide 53, it says Jackson and the Bank of the United States. Jackson was very, very mistrusting of the Bank of the United States and thought that the Bank of the United States was absolutely absolutely antithetical to the program of letting the producers work out competitively their own economic best interests. The bank was something to be manipulated by the Whigs and the financiers and the non-producers. Jackson and many Democrats said that the only real money was hard money. This is money that was actual gold and silver. This is not soft money. This is not paper money. Nicholas Biddle was the first director of the Bank of the United States, and really used the bank's power to control America's financial system, much to the Democrats' chagrin, or much to their displeasure. 1832, the bank wasn't going to expire until 1836, but in 1832, Biddle used his connections in Congress to get Congress to pass another 20-year extension on the charter of the bank. This was seen as just absolutely kind of unacceptable. This was the bank using political connections to ensure its longevity and its ability to make more money off the backs of the producing classes of people. Jackson essentially said, "This is blackmail. This you can't do this. This is absolutely terrible." And he said that Congress shouldn't be able to create an institution that is that powerful and can essentially control so much of our financial sector. And so, in 1832, he vetoed it. This is probably Jackson's biggest veto. This is Jackson essentially changing the way that presidents used the veto. Up until Jackson, most presidents only vetoed relatively few pieces of legislation, and then they only vetoed relatively few pieces of legislation because they thought that those pieces of legislation were actually unconstitutional. Jackson vetoes the bank because he says it's a bad idea, it's bad for the people. He says, "I am the people, I speak for the people, and I am their champion, and so I'm going to try to destroy this bank." And he was successful. Jackson's re-election over Henry Clay in 1832 absolutely ensured that this was that the Second Bank of the United States was going to be destroyed. Slide 54 shows the downfall of the Mother Bank. Democratic cartoon celebrating the destruction of the Second Bank of the United States. So with the destruction of and we're looking ahead on slide 55, with the destruction of the Second Bank of the United States, what does this do? Well, all the funds that were in the Second Bank of the United States get withdrawn from that. All the government's funds get withdrawn from the Second Bank of the United States and go to what are referred to as pet banks. These pet banks are local banks, smaller banks, state-chartered banks that have, usually they're called pet banks because they're chosen because they have some kind of connection to people in power. So if we decide to, the government decides to withdraw its funds from the Second Bank of the United States and put them into Wells Fargo, it's because the person who owns that Wells Fargo bank is, the favorite brother of some member of the United States Senate, or we're going to deposit a bunch of funds of the United States government into this bank down here, into you know, Kern Federal Credit Union or Valley Strong Credit Union or whatever, and it's because the people who are, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury is related to the person who runs that bank. So all of the funds get withdrawn from the Second Bank of the United States and deposited into much smaller banks. Without the Second Bank of the United States being able to kind of exercise some authority and some regulatory function over the economy, the amount of cash, remember, because now banks can just print money, any bank can print money. Banknotes in circulation go from 10 million in 1833 to 149 million in 1837. So that's 4 years, and 4 years, and you see a 14, almost a 15 x multiplicative. Just the amount of cash in circulation just skyrockets. It goes through the roof, and this causes a general inflation where the price level of everything in the economy goes up and up and up, and certainly the inflationary pressures decrease the actual wages. So people out there earning money for an hourly wage, when everything else in the economy goes up in price, the actual real buying power of their wage decreases. So this is how the economy is working after the second bank has been destroyed. Speculators, people who are, engaging in speculative capitalist kind of projects, the wage earners are really suffering. The people who are engaging in speculative capital projects are actually really, really coming out ahead because there is so much money just being injected into the system. Inevitably, though, this cash being injected into the system pumps everything up, and prices of everything kind of just go through this speculative bubble, and then it bursts in 1837. And this is burst through a couple of different things. Number one, in 1836, the United States federal government says we're no longer going to accept any state bank chartered currency as payment for land. So to purchase land from the United States federal government, you have to pay for that land in hard currency. That's actual gold or silver. So it makes a bunch of money that's out there floating around in the economy, makes a bunch of that money absolutely worthless for speculative ventures like buying land. Also, at that same time, there is a recession going on in Great Britain, which decreases the amount of cotton that economy can absorb. At the same time, people are overproducing cotton, which again makes it, people are overproducing cotton, and the decrease in demand for cotton leads to a glut in the cotton market, and it destroys vast sections of the southern economy. So the Panic of 1837 really unleashes a pretty serious, devastating economic effect on the United States. Take a look at slide 56. This is the Times. It's an 1837 engraving that blames Andrew Jackson's policies for the economic depression that the U.S. Finds itself in. Just essentially showing all kinds of economic catastrophes. Slide 57 talks about Van Buren. So Jackson's Vice President Martin Van Buren, again the little the little magician, becomes president of the United States in 1836. He beats out the Democrats, beats out the anti-bank wing of the Democratic Party, I should say. Van Buren says in 1837, he says, we're not going to keep the funds anymore of the U.S. government in these pet banks. We're going to go back, we're going to go ahead and take them off of those balance sheets, and we're going to bring them to the U.S. Treasury. So they're directly under federal control. It wasn't until 1840 that Congress actually approved this policy. It was repealed in 1841, and then it was reinstituted in 1846. This was a very, very rough time for the economy, and there was no real way to go forward. The real thing that gets the economy back on very, very solid footing, one of the things that gets the economy back on very, very solid footing is the gold rush, 1848, and all the gold that California brings into the economy really, really helps kind of get the economy going again. Slide 58 talks about the election of 1840. In the election of 1840, William Henry Harrison is again a military commander who runs for office, much in the same vein as Jackson. He's portrayed in the 1840 election, William Henry Harrison, as the quote log cabin candidate. Although William Henry Harrison is very aristocratic and comes from a pretty privileged background, he gets portrayed as the champion of the common man, very much in the style of Jackson, and he gets the election. He wins the election with a record voter turnout of 80% of eligible voters. Harrison wins a sweeping victory. Oddly enough, William Henry Harrison gets inaugurated as president of the United States, and his vice president of the United States is John Tyler. And one of the great presidential electoral phrases of all time is Tippecanoe and Tyler too, referring to the Battle of Tippecanoe that William Henry Harrison was part of and victorious in, and Tyler too. Tyler was essentially a Whig. I mean, he didn't agree with the Democrats in terms of anything else, but he signed on to be the vice president. And then when William Henry Harrison is inaugurated, it's very cold, it's very rainy. He goes out and delivers his inauguration speech, and it's over an hour long, and he refuses to wear a coat. Unfortunately, he catches pneumonia, and he ends up dead a month later. So the second bullet point is his accidency, which is a play on calling the President of the United States His Excellency. And so John Tyler is his accidency, and he is made President of the United States. And certainly Tyler has a presidency that is almost bereft of any serious accomplishments, and he can't get anything done because the Democratic Party isn't really behind him, and he can't really get a thing done in Congress. And so this kind of showcases the idea of the importance of political parties through the Jacksonian era, through the democratization of America during this time. If you don't have a political party behind you, Powerful presidents aren't really powerful at all. Slide 59 looks at the returns from the presidential election of 1840. Slide 60 is a political cartoon from 1840. Shows public opinion as the almighty lever of politics and democracy. That's going to end our my commentary on Chapter 10. Certainly, I'll see you guys in the virtual meeting spaces, and you guys can ask me some questions. Until then, hope you guys are safe, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.